honoring our heritage on this edition of Truth and Love. I'm Dale Johnson, and you're listening to Truth and Love, a podcast of the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors, where we seek to provide biblical solutions to the problems that people face. This week on the podcast, I have with me Dr. Howard Eyrich. He's a retired pastor of counseling at Briarwood Presbyterian Church. He currently serves as director of the D-Min in Biblical Counseling at Birmingham Theological Seminary, and he's a professor for Masters University of Divinity. He's also an ACBC fellow and an Academy member. He has education from Bob Jones, achieved his BA there at Bob Jones. He has an ED from Faith Theological Seminary, a THM from Dallas Theological Seminary, a D-Min from Western Theological Seminary. He's done PhD studies at California Coast University, and he's done postdoctoral studies in gerontology at the University of Georgia. Howard, it's so good to have you here on this 500th edition of Truth and Love. And today we're celebrating, honoring our heritage. And I thought you'd be a great person to help us to do that well. Brother, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here with us.
Oh, thank you, Dale. It's good to be here.
Man, it's encouraging to me, Howard, how you're continuing to study all of these formal pieces of education that you're pursuing. And I want to talk to you at some point about the gerontology studies. That's really interesting to me, but that's not our task today. What I want us to talk about today is looking back, honoring our heritage with ACBC, the history as we began in 1976 with NANC. I want to get this started with just a personal reflection, Howard. One of the most exciting and fun things that I get to do is sit down with people just like you who were there in the early days. And I love just to ask questions, to hear some of the stories from early on. And today we're going to let our listeners to the podcast in on some of those personal conversations that we've had in the past. And first question I want to ask, Howard, is just give a reflection. I mean, you were trained directly by Jay. You were in the room very early on. What was that training like? Maybe give a favorite story of your training with Jay. I think that would be a good way to start our honoring today.
I would enjoy doing that. The training program at CCF, which is where Jay was working at that point and ministering, consisted of 10 weeks. And when I took it, you didn't have a class. You came in at noon, and the secretary would take your your dinner order, and then she would assign you to 2 cases to observe in that day. And so at 1:00, we'd start counseling, and it'd be 2 observers in each counseling session. Jay was counseling, George Scipione was counseling, and that was about it at that point. Sometimes John Bettler, but not very often John, but sometimes. So I drew 2 of Jay's cases. So I was sitting in with 2 cases with Jay. And about halfway through one of those cases, which was a marital case, the couple were late arriving. And I often tell this story to my classes, and I say, I don't know where I got the nerve to do this, but I turned to Jay and I said, Jay, if I come back and take this seminar a second time, would you let me sit in that seat and counsel, and you sit over here in the observer's seat and coach me? And Jay, right from the very beginning, wanted us to call him Jay. It was a very casual relationship. And I picked up on some unique things about him pretty quickly. I'm an observer of people, so I picked up very quickly. If Jay was going to say yes to something, he had this little quirky grin that would come on his face. And so I knew before he said yes, he was going to say yes. But he turned to me and he said, yes, Howard, I will do that for you. And so I came back and took the seminar a second time and drew a counseling case with a married couple, and Jay sitting there at my elbow. And about the 3rd or 4th session with that couple, Jay said, Howard, could I say something? And I said, of course, sir. And if you picture a Y and picture me going down the right side of the Y with that couple, Jay just backed it up to the junction and turned it down the left side of the Y and restarted that direction and just turned it over to me. Never said another word, just turned it back to me. And then when we got to the supper seminar that afternoon from 4 to 6, which was the next sequence in a counseling day, Jay never offered a critique. The other observer reported what had happened. And I just went on with that counseling case, going down that why. And I've often told my students, the man was a master teacher, a joy to work with, really was. But we would have counseling from 1 to 4. At 4, the secretary would bring in the supper orders, and we would sit around that table. And if I were the counselor and you were my observer, you reported what the case was and what I did, and I had to defend it. And I'll tell you, Dale, I still think it was one of the best learning modules I've ever participated in. And I did that. I was later hired by CCF 1 day a week to start with, and then full time. And I became a regular counseling staff and did that for, I think it was 5 or 6 years with CCF. And then they moved me south, as we'll talk about later. And I continued to do that training program in the same manner. And then I moved to Miami and I did the same thing. And when I moved to St. Louis, I did the same thing. So for about 20 or 25 years, I did that kind of training Monday after Monday after Monday. So that's one of my favorite stories from those early days. That was 1971 or 72. I always have to stop and calculate which year it was.
Howard, that's an incredible story. And it's really interesting to me as I hear you describe that it's really life on life discipleship as you experience that with learning directly from Jay and even the other counselors. Skip was in the room. Apparently you listened to him several times, and just hearing that, I think, is just really exciting. It wasn't mass production. It's how do we disciple the next person to do this effectively? And you're doing the counseling. He's in there observing. You're reflecting on it a little bit later that afternoon, and just think about the wealth of information that you glean over week after week after week, as you mentioned, even year after year after year. It's pretty incredible, pretty exciting to think about. Now, I want to leave something open-ended and just let you sort of run with it here, Howard, as you think about the early days of NANC. You mentioned CCF, which started Christian Counseling Educational Foundation, that started in 1968. And what you described was a story in the early 1970s. NANC started in 1976. Just talk about some of those early days in the movement as biblical counseling was getting going. Quite slow in process, or we certainly didn't have what we have as far as digital communication and things moving at the speed of the internet today. So talk about some of those early days. I think it'd be good to hear some of your reflections there.
Well, as you said, Jay founded NANC in 1976 in conjunction with John Bettler and the rest of the staff at that point in time. And as far as I can remember, there were about 200 attendees at the first conference we did. I don't remember how we gathered them, except that there were a lot of folks that came who had been through the training program the previous few years. But Dr. Bettler insisted that NANC had to be a separate organization from CCF to be a viable certifying body. And at that meeting, Dr. Bob Smith, a medical doctor, was the volunteer leader that took over until 1981. And at that point, there was a termination of the organization considered because it was just kind of floundering at that point, and nobody had the time to invest in it. And I argued that we should not terminate it, that in our culture, we needed a peer review body with best practice standards in order to have any kind of viable acceptance in the culture in which we live. And as a result, a stipend was established to pay an executive director part-time, and the body appointed me to that role. So from 1981 to 1987, and I'm working from memory, Dale, on dates, but I think that's pretty close, I became the executive director. By 1987, as department chair of biblical counseling at Covenant Theological Seminary, I was teaching 10 hours a semester. In addition, along with 5 other pastors, I founded a biblical counseling center in St. Louis, and I just no longer had the bandwidth for the role of NANC. So at that point, Bill Good was appointed to that role, And he had his church's full cooperation and administrative staff. And with that support, Bill could take the organization to the next level. I don't know what other word to use except to say it was fun to watch it grow at that point. And Bill had quite an influence with the regular Baptists. And so he began to recruit heavily among the regular Baptists. And what started out as a Presbyterian organization pretty soon became heavily Baptist populated, which was, in my opinion, was really good. Rather than becoming just one representing one group, it began to spread and have a broader influence. And then there was some interesting things along the way during that era. My wife was very much involved. She helped me with administrative work, and she and I basically, we were the conference directors in those days. And we had one conference in Chicago, and Henry Brandt was lined up to be the keynote speaker at 6 that evening. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, Pam and I were in Chicago going over details, making sure that the hotel had things set up the way we wanted them set up. And I looked at Pam and I said, "Have you heard anything from Henry when he's getting in?" And she said, "No." I said, "You better go call him." Well, she called Henry and he answered sitting in his office back in Florida. and Pam said, "Dr. Brandt, you're supposed to be here in Chicago today to be our keynote speaker tonight." And Henry said, "Oh my, that got past me. I'll be there." And I found out later he kept a go bag sitting in his office. He grabbed that go bag and got to the airport, and my wife picked him up and got him to the hotel just in time to get him on the platform that night.
Oh my goodness. Well, as somebody who runs the conferences now, that would be a huge nightmare. You've prepared all this, all this in advance, and then your speaker who's supposed to speak that night is not showing up. Oh, man, that all resonates with me. It's interesting to think about that, Howard, your responsibility back in those days, and even now, your reflection as you come to an annual conference to see what the Lord has done. That's sort of, I want to ask you about some of your observations in terms of growth, because as we reflect, we can see you have to have beginning somewhere, and to see now where the Lord has brought us. I mean, it's incredible. And, people who are now laboring in the modern era, I think we need to appreciate what the Lord has done that gives us a sense of growing even today. That kind of stuff just doesn't happen, right? And that's not because of us as individuals. It's because of, what the Lord has done over long periods of time. And now we get to pick some of the fruit that you guys have labored over for so long. And so just to hear some of your reflection, even on your observations, perspectives that you've seen the way biblical counseling grow, the movement itself grow, NANC, or now ACBC in particular, grow. Give us some of those reflections, Howard.
Well, like most fledgling organizations, NANC had challenges. Nonetheless, it experienced a slow and steady growth. Churches were increasingly interested in establishing counseling as a particularized ministry. However, there were not enough trained people to fill the request. I remember one year, I think it was either 87 or 88, 6 churches queried me about whether I would consider applying for the role of counseling pastor. Attendance at conferences continued to grow during that period of time. And then a businessman in Atlanta contacted me. I had family ties in Atlanta at that point, about opening a freestanding center there in Atlanta. By this time, Jay Adams had moved to Macon, Georgia, and attended First Presbyterian Church. So during 76 and 77 school year, this businessman paid for 1 day a week of my salary, and also paid for a weekly round trip plane fare for me to commute from Philadelphia to Atlanta. So I would teach our training class on Monday. Back in second year I was at CCF, they asked me to develop a training class in the mornings. I would teach a class from 10 to 12, which eventually Wayne Mack took over when I moved south. So I teach the class from 10 to 12, Monday and Thursday. And then from 1 to 4, we'd engage in the supper seminar. Then from 4 to 6, we'd counsel on Monday nights until 9. And on Thursdays, I'd head to the airport instead of counseling and head for Atlanta. And my father-in-law would pick me up at the airport when I got in and take me home. And then the next morning, he'd take me to Decatur, to the office there. And so that's how we started the ministry in Atlanta and Macon. In Macon, that was an interesting experience because that year, those years in Macon, I'd work up to a 10-hour day teaching and training, and then catch a flight home the first year doing it from the South. So it was you just kind of stretched yourself to get things going, so to speak. Then they moved me south, had a contract between Macon and Atlanta with CCF, all under CCF's auspices for that 3 years. And I built a house between Macon and Atlanta and commuted to both of them. And a young man by the name of Andy Boswell approached me and asked me about doing an internship. So he came on staff with us, and we made enough money out of funds from the counseling ministry to pay Andy. And Andy would travel to Macon with me as well and counsel in Macon with me as well. So he would do a day's worth of counseling in Macon. And on the drive home that night, somewhere between 8 and 10 o'clock, we'd do a download of his cases, and I'd do my supervision with him driving home. I also look back at some of those things. How in the world did we pull all that off? So by 1980, the center at Macon Church had grown sufficiently to become a full-time operation. However, Jim Baird took a call, who was the pastor of Macon, took a call to Miami, to Granada Presbyterian Church, and he asked me to join him on his staff and develop a counseling ministry in Miami. So the church in Macon called Dr. John Grawley, who moved from Philadelphia, had finished his doctoral work. And I remember he served 8 years with the church in Macon while we went on to Miami. The ongoing challenge to maintain purity became evident at Macon because the director who followed Dr. Grawley led the ministry into integration, and the ministry began to dissipate. By 1981, I had moved to Miami. Within 90 days, the counseling schedule was full. And during the next 4 years, it continued that way. We had, during those years in Macon and then in Miami, I continued that same training program we had done in CCF in Philadelphia. We replicated that week after week. The only difference was that the program was limited to 6 people per week instead of 12. I just didn't have the time for the bigger group. Lay people joined the pastors and missionaries for teaching and training, and each participated in observing cases, as I had mentioned earlier. This training program was frequently populated with Hispanic pastors. So we began to move biblical counseling into that community. Hispanics were frequent counselees as well at Granada. And within the past year, one of those counselees from those days in Granada queried me as I would be their supervisor for ACBC third phase supervision. In addition to Granada, I began teaching lay counseling classes and Sunday school curriculum, and regularly recruited our elders and our deacons to participate in those training sessions that we did then. I continued that when I moved to Briarwood and taught a lay training class every year for my entire career from there on, so until I quote unquote retired at 78. The Atlanta Biblical Counseling Center was maintained by Pastor Dial. When I moved to Macon, we kind of closed the office, but Dr. Dial continued to use the counseling center as an extension of his church. Then I was offered a sabbatical in 1985 and 86 school year and went to Athens, Georgia, to go to the University of Georgia. And a young man by the name of Lou Priola contacted me and asked about engaging in an internship. So we worked out an arrangement. I raised half the funds to support him to begin with, and I raised a handful of money for operational expenses. Dr. Dial provided office space in his church, and Lou Priola moved to Atlanta and took over the Atlanta Biblical Counseling Center, which he then ran for the next 10 years. And I served as his board chairman during those 10 years. So I maintained contact with Lou. And also during that time, Lou developed a mentoring relationship with Jay, who by that time was living in South Carolina. Others like Ron Alchin in Chicago were developing biblical counseling in areas throughout various parts of the country through innovative options, establishing nuthetic counseling ministries and building NANC. I don't honestly remember the numbers of NANC along the way. All I know is we continue to see a growing presence. Then in 1988, another unusual opportunity occurred. Trinity Theological Seminary, the old online school, recruited me to teach biblical counseling. I was hesitant about the school's uniqueness, as that at that point, distant education was kind of an anomaly. But nonetheless, as executive director of NANC, I had unbelievable number of calls from people. How do I get training in nuthetic counseling? So I saw the Trinity program as an opportunity as a delivery system. You wouldn't believe it unless you went back and counted the numbers, but over that period of time, 20 years or so, we had more than 3,000 people go through those various training programs and degrees through the old Trinity. Then when Heath Lambert proposed the name change, I was actually an early supporter of that. I personally had a strong affinity for nuthetic, but the word did not have a reference point to the general populace, like behaviorism has a reference point to the population. Nuthetic didn't have any reference point. So once it was explained to people, the uniqueness of the approach would make sense. But for the average pew dweller, the word was enigmatic. Biblical counseling, while not as definitive, was nonetheless more broadly understood. This contributed to the rapid growth under Heath's leadership and beyond. One current example of growth and influence is a recent ACBC supervisee here in Alabama. Through being a volunteer with DHR to run some small groups for them, as a certified biblical counselor, they have now begun to refer their counseling cases to her, which is quite interesting to reach into that community as biblical counselor. But it's because she had already laid the groundwork by being a volunteer. And when she got certified, they just recognized and valued her, so they began to use her. And I still have the opportunity to coach her, even though she's finished her ACBC. Every once in a while, she'll send me a case, say, help me with this one, would you please? So
yeah, that's really neat to see. I like that final piece where you're showing, that there has become some level of respectability. I have a story like that. When I was leading ministry in Florida, we had a circuit judge who came to our church and wanted to, use us so that he could court order people to come to our counseling ministry. And we were sitting eating barbecue one day, and it was the circuit judge and me and my pastor. And I was telling him, Judge, we're not licensed by the state. And he said, well, it doesn't matter. I'm the authority. And wherever I tell them to go, that's where they have to go. How long do you want them? And we were dealing with domestic violence offenders, and we were dealing with those who've been caught in what was called drug court at the time. And so, you're starting to see a level of respectability, because his response was, I see what we're doing in the governmental system, and it's not working. We have a revolving door in the jail system. And I see what you guys are doing, and you're making some impact in the community. And so I want to send them there. And we actually saw several people come to faith through that ministry as well, which is really fun. So it's exciting to see that level of growth, that's happening with the respectability. So
I'll add one more story there that this reinforces that. Birmingham Theological Seminary has developed a ministerial degree program that we teach inside the prison system in Alabama. I get to teach 3 counseling classes in it. I teach intro, marriage and family, and advanced counseling in that program. And Dale, not overstate fact, if you'll check Faith Magazine, the next issue of Faith Magazine, there's going to be a story in there about the program. It's actually been transforming the particular prison in which the program is. Now, we're not the only ones. There are others in there doing work, but our guys are counseling. They're learning and they're going in and they're counseling their peers in prison. And the difference it's making is amazing.
I mean, that's incredible. Yeah, and I've heard similar stories in places like Louisiana and Texas, and man, it's just neat to see how the Lord just uses His Word faithfully and effectively in all kinds of scenarios, and that it's sufficient to handle this work. And man, it's so fun, Howard, honestly, to listen to you, just in a very humble way, to talk through the process of things that you lived, and the Lord has privileged you to see a lot of this growth that's happening. I do want to ask maybe one final question, and I don't want people to take this negative, and I know that you don't mean this negative, but I think it's good for us to evaluate areas of growth. And as we think about areas that not just celebrate ways in which we've grown, we're human beings. We're not perfect, that's for sure. There are areas where we still need to grow. Our knowledge is limited. There are still areas where we need to grow as we wrestle with Scripture, as we see problems that people are facing. How do we give biblically sufficient answers to these particular things? So I just want to get your perspective as somebody who's lived and walked during a time where you've watched, the concept of biblical counseling grow honestly in a very hostile environment where secular psychology has really overtaken the public narrative. Talk about areas where you can still see, you know what, these are ways that we need to grow as we wrestle with Scripture and as we deal with problems that people are facing in life.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to speak to that. In 1988, I co-authored a book entitled Totally Sufficient with Dr. Heinzen. The reason for that book was the current fuzzy thinking regarding sufficiency. Heath and others have produced other volumes on this matter in recent years. However, the necessity for creating a website with a declaration of sufficiency of Scripture and gathering leadership signatures leaves little doubt that there is yet a lot of work to do to clarify how sufficiency interacts with culture. I hope the current debate will become more about iron sharpening iron, resulting in clarity for the next generation. My recent research indicates that a large body of folks who identify with biblical counseling are confused about this issue. Since you, Dale, have led us towards engaging the mental health culture, and because of anxiety and depression are the number one and number two issues in contemporary culture, the following should be considered, I think. One, while the movement has been doing a good job of counseling those suffering with anxiety, there needs to be a comprehensive biblical theology of anxiety published. I began working on that a couple of years ago, and then in 2023, the man who had taken my place when I retired decided to retire, and the pastor asked me to return and work full time. So that project got put on the back burner, and I haven't been able to return to it. But I really think it needs to be done. I would also think it'd be a worthwhile project to produce a biblical theology of depression. We've got lots of different articles, but I don't think there's a book that's really comprehensively looking at it through the lens of biblical theology. And then thirdly, I think how we biblically understand and deal with schizophrenia. I think that there needs to be a lot of depth of work on that one as well. For lots of reasons, I personally am prone to think there is a physiological component to that one, but it makes it all the more important that we figure out how we interrelate with it. And then you, Dale, and your staff have led the way in determining an appropriate response to abuse culture. Yet it appears there is work to be done here in the area that BCers do not have a consensus on how we ought to do this. The movement has done an outstanding job of producing practical volumes, journal articles, and blogs. Works like the recent publication of Dr. Chen, Mental Disorders Diagnosis, Ernie Baker's edited series on issues in biblical counseling, and my forthcoming book, A Layman's Guide to Secular Counseling Theories, are good examples of the type of apologetic work the movement must continue to produce. On a practical level, the organization has reached a formidable constituency. It may be time to consider negotiating with Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company or another company to create a pathway for biblical counselors to gain liability insurance, or a survey for current members to understand how they navigate this matter might be helpful. And then finally, out of that, create a document recommending how biblical counselors, even lay counselors, can qualify for some sort of liability insurance. It is a litigious world as we work in, as you're well know, and it, regardless of who you are, it can be a difficult thing. At Briarwood, we have been blessed to have a methodology by which all of our counselors are covered under a church policy. Smaller churches aren't going to have that. So I think it's an area where our organization can do some exploration, come up with some helpful, useful methodologies to do that. So those would be areas where I think that come to my mind off the top of my head almost that we need to continue to address.
Howard, this is great. And I think it's really helpful that we can have an honest assessment of, these types of issues where we need to continue to grow and areas of focus. You're right, man. We live in a litigious society. And, these are ways to be helpful to our people as they're trying to serve in different locations. And even some of the practical works that you mentioned, refining that, bringing some of the valuable works together from our history and then putting that together, rooted in more of a biblical, theological, more broad perspective of issues. Man, I think that's so helpful. It just shows that we need to continue to grow. And the apologetic piece that you mentioned, I think, is important. That'll continually be something we have to do from generation to generation, reproducing things like your Totally Sufficient book, which I love. And I asked you the other day if it was still in print because it's something that I use consistently. And once a book goes out of print, some of our academic institutions won't allow us to use it anymore. So yeah, I would recommend that book as being even still very appropriate and very helpful, because we're not innovating something new, Howard, right? What we're doing is bringing the scripture to life in every generation. The goal is not to become innovative in the sense that, we're going to create something new. If that's the case, we're stepping away from scripture. But in how do we take the scripture in its timely truths and appropriate it in a specific time period for a specific issue? Thanks for helping us think through this. Listen, this has been a fun way for me to celebrate. I can't even believe I'm saying this, that we've done 500 episodes of Truth and Love. And it's been fun to spend it with you, Howard, somebody who's meant so much to the movement, so much to CCF and also to NANC and ACBC. I so appreciate you, brother. And thanks for reflecting on these stories, giving us some insight what those early days were like. So thanks for your time today.
Well, I enjoyed it. I'm glad to do it. And for me, it's almost fun, wholly fun to reminisce and look how God has moved along the way and given this poor old farmer boy an opportunity to be part of the journey and ride the wave, so to speak.
Well, it's been fun. And we appreciate your service and your work and as you continue to serve the Lord in these ways. And appreciate you, brother.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're listening to Truth and Love, a podcast of ACBC. You know what? We are so excited today to celebrate our 500th episode of Truth and Love. Over the past 10 years, ACBC has been able to reach in the millions with biblical resources for the problems that people face. And we are so thankful for how the Lord has used this particular resource, the Truth and Love podcast. And we want to celebrate with you, our listeners. So I want you to go to any of our social media outlets. That's Facebook, Twitter, X, or Instagram. Go to any of those social media outlets and repost the announcement of this 500th episode. You'll be entered to win 2 free tickets to our annual conference coming up in October in Fort Worth, Texas, Ancient Paths, Soul Care in Past Places. And there's also a book bundle from ACBC available as well. We'll pick a winner on Friday, January 24th, and announce that via our social media portals. So I want to encourage you right now to go to your social media portal, repost this 500th episode of Truth in Love so that you can be entered for an opportunity to win 2 free tickets to our annual conference and a book bundle from ACBC. And with those resources, you can find out more about ACBC and all the resources that we offer at biblicalcounseling.com.